Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to get started. There's still some stragglers, and we're going to let them come in as they will. I was worried we weren't going to get started there for a while. Everyone was enjoying their drinks so much. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm editor-at-large at Reuters, based here in London. Before we get going, I just want a quick word on the Wi-Fi connection. There's something I should always do, and now I've been given the passwords. We've got this dedicated loop now. Thomson Reuters event. The password is legal 3 vent. It's written somewhere in this room. Hopefully you've all seen that, because you need that to vote pre the debate and post the debate. If you could I want to remind you to cast your first vote now if you haven't already done so. There's the motion up there. Post Brexit, tax haven status will make Britain great again, exclamation mark. It's reasonably controversial. You can vote via the app. I think we're going to put the details up on the screen. Are we going to put the details? Yeah, there you go. Up on the screen. 6:30, you take that one, you text your vote, you can text legal debate. Look, it's up there. I'll let you do that. I'm sure you've all been here before. I'm sure you know how to vote. And I'll come to that in just a second. Let me just say a few brief words about the motion and what our speakers are debating this evening. I should tell you, we've had some toing and froing on this motion. Until about a week ago, we were convinced that the word hard before the word Brexit was a safe bet. We've taken that out, I think, for obvious reasons, but that's anyone's guess. The last word in the motion has also stirred emotions. Surely some will argue Britain never lost its greatness. So why debate it? Again, we'll probably get to that. Whatever each side thinks of hard versus soft, small versus great, the focus this evening is on the sort of changes that we might see regarding the tax and the regulatory environment after we leave the EU, and the impact that those changes will have on the UK's grassroots voters, on business, on growth, on our competitiveness, on the perception of the UK as a place to reside and indeed to do business. Most of you here will recall the Chancellor's comments made back in January that the UK could cut taxes to stay competitive if it's locked out of the single market after Brexit. Those comments clearly set the cat among the pigeons, really stirred things up. Would we see a radical change in the UK economic model? Could the UK really turn itself into a full-blown tax haven? How beneficial would a Singapore-style shift, a regime many point to now, really be for our economy? A race to the bottom on corporation tax, on regulation and labour costs. On the other hand, why assume, as many seem to, that offering tax incentives mean we'll become a tax haven, rife with scandal, money laundering and corruption? Could Brexit be an opportunity for us to rally and become a model of social justice, one in which deregulation and prudent regulation are not in conflict? So lots of variables, lots of possible scenarios, lots for our panel to debate this evening. Let me introduce them quickly, and then I'll get to the pre-debate vote. As usual, we've got 2 for, 2 against, classic Oxford-style debating. They'll alternate opening statements before we open it up to some Q&A from you, a chance for them to have a go at each other as well, and then we'll get the closing statements. Arguing for the motion, if I could just do these introductions now, that post-Brexit tax haven status will indeed make Britain great again. David Goldberg, QC from Gray's Inn Tax Chambers. Few, I think, have knowledge of tax law like David has. On the same side, Douglas Carswell, former MP, elected to Parliament 4 times, I think I'm right in saying, 2 different parties, now advises on all things digital disruption and the impact that's having on the economy. Arguing against the motion, Dr. Joanna Perkins, CEO of the Financial Markets Law Committee. Before joining the FMLC, Joanna was at the Bank of England and the Law Commission. I think that's right. And arguing with Joanna Chris Huhn, journalist and former politician, someone who's advocated stronger international measures to clamp down on tax havens, formerly Secretary of State for Energy and Climate in the 2010 coalition government, as I'm sure you'll all remember. Right, let's get the results of the pre-debate vote. That is kind of where we stand right now. Let's get to our debaters arguing for the motion. 8 to 10 uninterrupted minutes from the podium. David Goldberg. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What does tax haven status mean? What makes a nation great? Those are the questions which this debate raises. It's not about Brexit, because that's a given. What we need to decide is only whether tax haven status, as defined for the purposes of the motion, will make us great. An advantage which comes from opening the debate is the ability to define its terms. I start with the concept of greatness. I suggest that a nation is great when it is bold and confident, vigorous and open, liberal, economically strong, and unafraid, by which I mean that its citizens are not put in fear or overburdened by the power which the state can bring to bear on them. What then is meant by tax haven status? And since it is implicit in the terms of the motion that Britain needs to be made great again, what now stops us from being great? Here I speak of matters about which I know. I speak about what tax systems do or should do, and I evaluate the question of greatness in the context of the messages which our tax system presently broadcasts. The thunder of a nation's character is heard most loudly in its tax policy. What is it which confers tax haven status? Tax haven status is not conferred by low rates of tax or by what are called flat taxes. There are plenty of jurisdictions which have low taxes, but which are not thought of as tax havens. And tax haven status is not conferred by the presence or absence of regulation. There are tax havens which are well regulated and non-tax havens which are badly regulated. My guess is that we shall hear from Dr. Perkins about the need for regulation, but that is not the issue. The need for regulation is undisputed. But what is regulated must be suitable for and capable of regulation. I suggest two features which will generally be taken to make a country a tax haven. The first is that it taxes only income which arises within its own borders. The second is that the tax system is clear, concise, easy to operate, and can be seen to balance the rights and obligations of the citizen and of the state. I have no doubt that the first feature is good for a country and for its economy. But as that is likely to be controversial and is not essential to my argument, I shall concentrate on the second. In a sense, we here in the United Kingdom operate two distinct tax systems. The first taxes employees through the mechanism of PAYE, and to the employees themselves, tax seems easy. It appears to have the second feature, but it doesn't have it. And for everyone else, for everyone who's trying to run in the UK a business, large or small, tax is not in any way easy. They are subjected to what is probably the most hideous tax system in the Western democracies. It lacks a single guiding principle, essential to the coherence of a tax system. The direct taxes alone take up 6 volumes, the longest tax system in the world, far longer than that of the USA, and a marked contrast to the brevity of the German direct code, which I am able to carry in one hand. I would have broken my shoulder if I'd bought the UK tax code. It is too long and too complex to be intelligible. It is unbalanced by the threat of penalties and even of criminal sanctions, which might be incurred by innocent error. There are situations in which taxpayers are discouraged from appealing, and it has had added to it what are in truth elements of discretion given to the administrator. It is being infected by bad ideas like BEPS. It leads to the wastage of resources in the obstinate struggle to be correct. The problems for both the administrator and the taxpayer are compounded by ignorant commentary, at best childish, at worst rabble-rousing, some of it from politicians, who are willing to ignore law and the need for law, essential to a free and energetic economy and democracy. As a result of this mix of bad law and bad politics, our system is no longer compliant with the rule of law, surely an essential element of greatness. The need to restore compliance is urgent, but instead of starting that task, the last finance bill, though not yet enacted, contained a proposal that in certain circumstances, lawyers should be subjected to a penalty for doing their job and advising people as to the law. That is a proposal so venal and contrary to the rule of law that it should, in this country, be unimaginable. But it has been imagined and nearly brought into law. That can surely only happen in a nation made small and supine, so that rights earned with blood can be swiftly and silently taken away by our own parliament, while too many are afraid to speak out. It used to be possible for an English common lawyer to go abroad, knowing that he or she came from a country which created the finest legal system the world has ever seen, and gave it the guiding principles of the rule of law. We could be proud to fly our flag. Now it is stained by the sins against those beacon lights which are committed presently most clearly by our tax system, and which bring with them the risk of infecting other areas of law. As a result of this and more I could describe given time, this country is burdened by an unbalanced tax system. We should be, I am, ashamed of it. We need to apologize for the poverty of our example. Washing the flag in attempted expiation is more appropriate than flying it. I think everyone here who has ever filled in or tried to fill in their own tax return will know the twin feelings of oppression and depression which overwhelm you when you start the task. It doesn't have to be like that. A simpler, clearer tax system, the type of tax code that is found in so-called tax havens, does not impose feelings of that kind. But it still does the job of allowing the nation's revenue to be collected, and does it better and more easily, more transparently than our code does now. Our present code is nasty and mean. It saps the vitals from our democracy and deprives us of greatness. It belongs to a nation sending a message that it is unpleasant and brown, not green and pleasant. It belongs to a nation which is dispirited, oppressed, and weak, not to a nation which is liberal, optimistic, confident, bold, and strong. If we were to change our tax system to one which is simpler and clearer, a change which can be made relatively easily given the will to perform radical excision. If we were to change the system to one like that of places called tax havens, the mood of the productive nation would lift and positive energy would be created. We might indeed become optimistic, confident, bold, and strong.
You've got about a minute, David.
If we have I don't need a minute. If we have the strength to change our tax system in that way, we might again be worthy of the adjective great. And what is the disadvantage to that? I cannot think of one. Whatever we think of Brexit, whether we think it bad or good, it inevitably brings the need and an opportunity for change. Let us be bold and make the changes which, in any event, Brexit or not, need and should be made.
Thank you very much indeed, David Goldberg. Up next, arguing against the motion, sorry, Joanna, is Joanna Perkins. Joanna, David thinks he knows what you're going to say. Let's see. Your 8 to 10 minutes starts now.
Thank you. Our contention is that tax haven status would not make Britain great. In other words, the UK should not pursue a strategy of low taxes, minimal regulation, and banking secrecy. And to support that contention, I have brought you 15 arguments. They're 15 alliterative arguments, because while the other side have all the tax expertise, I like to think our side has all the poetry. First, 5 arguments from political constraint: practicality, politics, policy, potential, and participation. Countries with a strong democracy like the UK typically find it hard to pursue tax haven status. Tax breaks for foreign corporations are not an easy political sell, and we've seen that. Moreover, in politics, I doubt there's a political mandate, in effect, for reshaping the UK economy this way. But since I'm in the company of political experts, I'll defer to them on that point. When it comes to policy, some believe that the referendum result was a vote for a cut in immigration. Whether you think they're right or wrong, it would be folly to think that immigration can be slashed while attracting foreign investment with tax breaks. The short truth is that companies take their capital to wherever skills are plentiful and available at competitive competitive wages. Removing competition from the labor market would simply undermine any incentives created by the tax breaks. And then there's our potential as a nation post-Brexit. We're told that free trade deals are what we need to achieve that potential, to make Brexit viable. But free trade partners don't want deals with deregulated economy. The only companies that want to buy hormone-injected beef or dodgy financial products are countries which themselves have lower food standards or less robust financial regulation. And then we come to participation, because it's a closely related point. UK firms will simply not be allowed access to EU markets post-Brexit for services if we're in the middle of a regulatory trajectory. If the UK's regulatory framework is not as robust as the European one, there will be no participation. As the governor of the Bank of England recently pointed out in relation to euro derivatives clearing, the key to a satisfactory Brexit outcome, which avoids market fragmentation, is shared regulatory standards. And then 5 arguments for why it would be wrong for the UK economy. Arguments from productivity, public services, pay, prosperity, and prudence. Tax havens, almost by definition, attract activity which is undertaken for tax minimization reasons. There's no guarantee that activity will be economically productive. And very low taxes can mean that it's hard for the government to pay for essential services, notwithstanding the tax haven attracts a great deal of capital. So as a result, public services in education and health may suffer, which brings us to prosperity. Because if tax havens are unwilling to put up with that sacrifice, they must either relocate a large tax burden onto the lower paid domestic taxpayer, or they must assume a very large public debt, as Singapore has in fact done, 112%. Neither strategy is calculated to increase prosperity. Pay. Higher levels of domestic taxes may be just one reason why a tax haven strategy normally results in escalating pay demands. Another might, of course, be that simultaneous squeeze on immigration. One of 2 outcomes can result. Either the government moves in an authoritarian manner to cap wages to attract foreign investment, or inflation increases in the wider economy along with those pay demands. And then prudence. Light touch regulation means increasing the risks in the financial system. As we've seen, if those risks materialize, the fallout can extend well beyond the financial system and damage the wider economy. So finally, 5 arguments about why it would be wrong for the British people. Prestige, probity, principled people, and prerogative. Prestige. Tax haven status looks, feels, and tastes like a small country strategy, and for good reason. If large economies engage in aggressive tax competition, their actions can destabilize the global economy, and one can expect other nations to resist strongly. By the same token, a rent-seeking strategy would almost certainly diminish Britain's soft power on the international stage. Probity. Tax havens don't attract just good capital. They attract dirty money. Jurisdictions with minimal regulation and maximum secrecy are exactly the kind of place that criminal enterprises like to do business. We've heard in this past year that the UK doesn't need experts, doesn't need a banker's Brexit, and even that it doesn't need Romanian fruit pickers. I disagree. I think we need all those things. But I'm certainly sure that we don't need mobsters, terrorists, and extortionists. Principle. Speaking of corruption, Global Financial Integrity, a think tank, estimates that $1 billion flows illegally out of emerging economies and into tax havens every year. This sum outweighs aggregate international development aid. As a matter of principle, the United Kingdom should resist, I say, becoming part of the problem for poorer nations. It should aspire instead to be part of the solution. People. Inequality normally increases in tax competitive jurisdictions because, as I explained, there's a relocated tax burden. This is not only bad for the economy, it's inherently unjust, which brings us finally to prerogative. Becoming a tax haven means giving foreign capital owners a collective veto over public policy. This substantive loss of national prerogative would sit uneasily not only with the strength of British democracy, but also with the rhetoric of sovereignty and national self-determination, which was ubiquitous during the referendum. It would seem odd, I think, that having repatriated sovereign prerogative from Brussels, we decided that the right thing to do was to cede it to the global plutocracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Douglas Carswell is arguing for the motion. Douglas, your 8 to 10 minutes starts now.
Be very wary when you hear politicians saying that they're going to make something great again. Why? Well, for a start, politicians have an uncanny habit of messing things up in the first place. David has rather brilliantly explained how successive governments have messed up our tax system, giving us an incredibly complex and arbitrary tax regime. But it's not just the tax system. Pretty much any system politicians seem to run, they seem to mess up, from railways to the NHS to IT systems. But there's an even more important reason why I think we need to be incredibly wary of politicians promising to make things great again. Because implicit in the idea of making something great again is the notion that things have got worse. There is in that statement something nostalgic, this idea that things need to be restored to some sort of golden, pristine past. That's simply not true. When Trump promises to make America great again, the rest of us should ask ourselves, has there ever been a better time to be alive in the United States than there is today? As for the idea that we need some sort of British Trump to make us great again, no thank you. The idea is complete nonsense. In 2017, we live longer, happier, healthier lives than ever before. Life expectancy over the past 60 years has increased by 20 years. That means the average Brit has a third more life to look forward to. Infant mortality is down 90% since the 1960s. Road traffic accidents, fatal road traffic accidents, are down 3/4 since the 1960s. Average incomes are up 120% since 1950, up by 30% since 1990. Of course, we're not a utopia. There are plenty of tragedies. The Grenfell fire, I think, makes it quite clear that we have profound questions about fire safety. Terror means we face a security threat. We're not a utopia, but we are absolutely not the dystopia that the extreme left and the extreme right want to convince the rest of us that we've become. So the question is not, should we make Britain great with tax or any other reform, but can we do things better? Can we do things better once we've left the European Union? And yes, we can, absolutely. What I believe is that people voted for the fact that they wanted to see things done better last June. A year ago, Vote Leave won the referendum, not by appealing to a sense of narrow Britain's gone to the dogs nativism. Despite the best efforts of one or two people who may disapprove of the referendum result, Vote Leave appealed to a sense of optimism. Think Gisela Stewart. Think Boris Johnson, not Nigel Farage. No. Our message was not about just taking back control, but taking back control so that we could make things better. And we do need to do better. When we joined what was to become the European Union in 1973, it looked like the future. France and Italy and Germany had, in the 1950s and 60s, enjoyed the most spectacular growth. When we joined what was to become the European Union in 1973, it accounted for 36% of global GDP. By 2020, it will account for, by some estimates, less than 20% of global output, and by some estimates, as little as 15%. We've had 30 years of Eurosclerosis. Over the past decade, the output of China has increased 140%, of India 80%, Indonesia 70%. In the EU, the only indices that have grown by that amount are those that measure debt and unemployment. For years, Europe's relative weakness was cited by the advocates of greater integration as a way of coping. I think we now need to recognize that integration and the Euro project helps explain Europe's underlying weakness and decline, its lack of growth, its innovation. Standardization of policy, the bedrock on which the EU stands, introduced regulation under the auspices of the single market, has become a pretext for a blizzard of regulation. Let me just give you one example. When the Clinical Trials Directive came in 2001, 12% of all clinical trials in the world took place in the UK. As a consequence of that regulation, it's now down to something like 2%. We've seen a dramatic decline in the European world share of patents. Common trade policy has presided over a fall in Europe's decline in world trade. A common currency has ruined the lives of tens of millions of Europeans. Europe has problems, but the UK is going to have to change, and I think Brexit is a great opportunity. Our economic model is not sustainable. We have today a record trade imbalance. Included in that, of course, is a 71 billion trade deficit with the EU, which incidentally gives lie to the idea that we're about to have restrictions on cross-channel trade from which our EU partners are the principal beneficiaries. We are seeing the massive accumulation of public debt. Flogging off central London property to try and balance the books is not a long-term economic sustainable strategy. We're living beyond our means. Brexit is our opportunity for change. It's our opportunity to open up the United Kingdom economy to the world. We need to learn to trade where the growth is. We need to become competitive. We need to address profound problems of productivity. Leaving the EU was never an end in itself. It was the starting point. Trade deals are the absolute key. This isn't really about changing our relationship with the 27 EU members. The really important thing is changing our relationship with the 165 non-EU states out there. Because it's those 165 non-EU states that account for almost all the world's growth over the past decade. We need to have an open economy, and absolutely central to that are low and simple taxes and less regulation. Now, like Singapore, cry our opponents. Where did we get this idea that Singapore was some sort of Dickensian workhouse? In 1950, Singapore per capita GDP was a third that of ours. Today, the average Singaporean is twice as wealthy as the average Brit. A final thought, if I may, if I've got a couple of minutes.
Yeah, you do.
Digital is overturning many assumptions. Digital, not Jean Monnet's 1950s, mid-20th century answer, is what we need to address. It's overturning many assumptions about size, about scale, about proximity to markets. I believe that all of that dooms the EU's giantism, a product of 1950s thinking. But it's going to fundamentally change our governing elite's assumptions about the tax base. Now, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister, as the cliche, I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase, famously described the art of taxation as that of extracting the maximum number of feathers from the goose with the minimum amount of hissing. In the digital age, the goose can fly. Yeah? In the 20th century, in order to get the wealth, governments taxed the wealth creators, and the wealth creators tended to be the people who made stuff. So they taxed factories and the payrolls behind those factories. It's difficult to move a factory or a payroll. But wealth creation today is IP, intellectual property. And intellectual property is as mobile as an email. I'm not just talking about the 1% of people who pay 27% of income tax. Wealth creation is hypermobile. Post Brexit, we need to make sure the UK is a place where capital and talent fly to, not a place where capital and talent fly away from. It's an extraordinary opportunity for us. It's absolutely vital that we get it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Douglas. Finally arguing against the motion is Chris Huhn.
Thanks, Axel. Let me make one point on David's presentation about taxation. I entirely agree with him. Nobody likes taxes. Nobody here likes taxes, and everybody would like a simpler German-style code rather than a British one. But it's a German-style code. We didn't need Brexit to simplify taxes. And I don't think we would be looking at David, one of the highest paid silks at the British bar, £3 million, according to the Daily Mail, a year in income, in order to make money out of, frankly, a complex tax code. If we had a German tax code, I have one feeling that I know somebody rather close to me would be having a rather smaller income than he has today. Reality is, whether it's tax or regulation, people will buy British because of quality and not because of a race to the bottom on tax or on regulation. They want a car that doesn't crash. They want a bank that actually pays your money back when you want it. They want a financial advisor who doesn't make off with the investment. They want to live in a tower block that doesn't go up in flames. And they want an airline that has enough fuel to land safely at Heathrow. Regulation matters, and taxes are needed to pay for a civilized society, for good schools, for well-educated fellow citizens, for sick people in our hospitals, and for the elderly for their pensions. Now, Douglas and his fellow Brexit fantasists, I'm sorry to be brutal about this, but they think we're going to have a new golden age of UK trade on the back of deals, as he said, with these countries that are growing so rapidly. Well, let me introduce a concept that clearly Douglas and some of the Brexiteers seem to have skipped at school: geography. We are not leaving Europe because we are still where we are. Transport costs matter. We trade more with the Republic of Ireland than we trade with both China and India combined. It's easier to trade across 21 miles to France than 3,010 miles to Boston. And if Brexit is going to be such a great boon, how come, to use the German example, Germany exports $76 billion a year to China, and we only export 18 billion. Nothing in the EU stopped us remedying that any more than we were stopped by remedying our tax complications. Brexit is just a displacement activity for hiding what we really need to do to improve our productivity, upgrade our skills, and ensure that we have a better educated political elite that respects facts, experts, argument, and doesn't pretend that you can have a cake and eat it too. The idea of tax haven status for Britain is frankly barking mad. First, the British government has been one of the key movers and shakers, clamping down on tax evasion historically. It has been anxious about the culture of tax payment in the UK. Every tax evader raises rates for everyone else who pays their taxes. The more tax evasion there is, the harder to get most people to pay their taxes. So the British government would have to reverse a stance it's held for 30 years. It might attract some dubious tax dodgers, but at the risk of encouraging 65 million people here to dodge more tax. I don't think that's going to be a net economic or financial benefit. Secondly, the government would surely worry about retaliation. Tax evasion is getting tougher, and the market for tax evasion is getting smaller. The leaks from Mossack Fonseca in Panama are one example. The payment by the German intelligence agency for Liechtenstein bank data is another. Recent CEO of Deutsche Post is just falling foul of exactly that leak. and is facing prosecution. The HSBC Geneva branch, the data was shared by the French who acquired it, and that's a third. Even if we decided that it made sense in policy terms to become a tax haven, how could we possibly assure potential tax evaders that we were more watertight and safe than the Swiss or the Panamanians or anyone else? Only this week there's been news of another hacking cyber attack. There are also state-sponsored leaks, and there are high-profile prosecutions in key potential markets. Look at the jail sentence for the perfume heiress Arlette Ritchie. These are all serious deterrents, and they are serious problems for a tax haven strategy. Thirdly, the government would need public support at home, and that would be likely to fail. Britain's political problem is very simple. We all want Scandinavian-style public services, but we want them at a US-style tax rate. And there, frankly, is no way of making those two things reconcilable. There is no consensus to cut tax rates even further at the cost of either higher borrowing or lower public spending. Labour would oppose it. Labour nearly won the last election by arguing for the defence of public services, despite a Marxism leader with an old-fashioned renationalisation programme. And we are not, let's be clear about this, we are not highly taxed. If you look at the OECD figures, we are 25th amongst developed countries in terms of our tax burden, taxes as a share of GDP. We are 21st of OECD countries, from the top, in terms of our public spending. There is no low tax and low spend way out of hard Brexit self-harm because the public won't wear it. And by the way, it's not what the Brexiteers promised. Remember the bus with the £350 million a week, which was going to provide all those goodies for the NHS? Well, it's not going to happen. Fourthly, the government needs itself the powers to clamp down on tax evasion, the transparency, the reporting arrangements, to chase terrorist financing and money laundering. So a withdrawal of international cooperation on tax, which is basically what we're saying here with tax havens, would inevitably compromise the domestic fight against terrorism. Every time a bomb went off, there would be a public outcry about our failure to cooperate with our partners on terrorist financing. Every time we had a 7/7, every time we had a 9/11, it would be curtains for a tax haven strategy. You might say, no man is an island, and no big island can be a tax haven. The government, frankly, would be crazy to change course. But for the government strategy to work, there's another essential condition. The banks would also have to play ball. And yet the banks are now acutely aware of the reputational risks that they run if they are caught, as HSBC was, in facilitating tax evasion. The result is that HSBC is now one of the toughest banks on regulatory compliance.
You've got about a minute, Chris.
And just remember what happened when the Swiss banks tried to avoid providing tax information to the US Internal Revenue Service. Their phones rang in Zurich. The New York offices were raided by the US Internal Revenue Services, and funnily enough, the Swiss government climbed down faster than Usain Bolt. So, are there any principles that desperate Brexiteers would really be prepared to uphold? Or is their fear for our economic prospects now so profound that we jettison every value which we've traditionally shared with our international partners? Do we now sell arms regardless of the user and regardless of the geopolitical consequences? Theresa May, remember, shot off to Washington to hold hands with Donald Trump, and look where that got her. We are now at the back of the US queue again for trade deals, and it's the Donald state visit is delayed without any new date. America first means Britain second. The truth is, there is no tax haven strategy for Britain, and not even a low tax strategy given the political pressures at home. It's a fantasy that a risky strategy that might work for a few tiny micro-states with populations smaller than half that of a London borough, which is what most tax havens are, can actually work for a country of 65 million people with a diversified economy that has to export a third of its GDP in goods and services, and whose tourist businesses alone employ far more people than the city and involve attracting millions of foreign visitors a year.
Gotta wrap it up.
Britain's economic success will be based on good global citizenship, not trashing our neighbours. Vote against.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Thank you to all of our speakers. I'm going to come to some questions. I've got plenty myself. Yeah, okay, we're going to start with the gentleman there, and then we'll come to you. Go ahead.
Hello. Very good speech by David Goldberg. We can see why you're a QC. And you stuck to the point, so no doubt several judges have pulled you up in the past if you've gone off the point. But I'd like to say the 3 countries where they have tried the experiment of no direct taxes, Monaco, Switzerland, where I was born, and Sri Lanka, where I'm from, don't have direct taxes, but interestingly enough, have quite strict rules on foreigners buying property, unless, of course, you buy in a designated area or only certain properties, which I wonder how you feel that might work, because obviously, as a tax haven, attracting investors internationally. Sri Lanka, for example, has very strict rules about where people can buy property. Monaco, Switzerland, similarly. And in England, this might, as was touched on, of course, by our other speaker, Joanna Perkins, might kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And then a very quick question for Chris Huhn. A very obscure Greek economist you'd never have heard of, who lived in Clapham, wrote a book about how England would leave the European Economic Community. Do you think that perhaps we should go back to that period when people were writing these books and see if they may actually have had something interesting to say after all? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you want to say something to that, Chris. But
Well, I'm very happy to cite, actually, what we were promised during the referendum by the Brexiteers. It was quite hard. I have to, first of all, confess not to being a lawyer, but to being an economist by background. It was quite hard to find a group of economists who would actually support Brexit, but there was one, and they were called the Economists for Brexit, and there were some quite relatively distinguished names amongst them. And they actually were silly enough to avoid the advice of a former chief economic advisor of the Treasury, who said if you ever give them a forecast, don't give them a date, because they actually produced a forecast, and their forecast was that there would be no fall in sterling. Well, it's down 14%. They predicted no rise in inflation, which would stabilize at 1.5%. In fact, the inflation rate is now up to 2.7%. They predicted strong growth of earnings at 3.5%, and in fact, it's now running at a third of that level, at 1.2%. And by the way, in financial services, it's gone negative. So real earnings are now dropping again. They were wrong, and frankly, I have absolutely no doubt that we will very clearly see what the results of Brexit are.
All right.
And that's why
Chris,
we had an early election.
all right, thank you. Yeah, and look, we're moving away from our motion here. Let me come to this question here, and we'll come to you, sir. Go ahead.
This is really for Douglas. Talking about the motion, I was struggling to understand your vision of a tax haven. You did eventually bring up the digital industries and tech industries, and I agree they are phenomenally important for our economy. What would you be offering to them? And do you think perhaps that Google thought it was living in a tax haven until it was informed otherwise quite recently?
And this is your space right now.
We've seen in Europe a lot of controversial issues where corporations have, some would say, avoided paying the tax that they should pay. I think Starbucks was a case, and there have been a number of cases. I would argue one of the reasons for that is because the nature of the European Union allows big corporations to shop around and decide in which jurisdiction they are going to pay tax. And I think that's not really politically long-term sustainable. I think you need to have low tax, and I hope I explained this, you need to have low tax and low regulation. There's a tendency for us to think we've got to do things because Europe is doing them, and we've got to compare our regulatory and tax regime to Europe's. But the European Union is a declining and shrinking part of a global economy in which Europe is an increasingly marginal and peripheral player. And I see Britain's future as trading with those countries and those continents that are growing. Almost all continents in the world have experienced pretty impressive growth over the past decade, with the sole exception of Europe. So why do we tie ourselves to a sort of crowded customs union? Why don't we look and see what other countries do in terms of tax and regulation? I think if we did that, we would discover that actually the European model is relatively, in global terms, high tax, high regulation, and complex. And that's one of the reasons why Europe is no longer the center of innovation and growth that it once was.
Okay.
Can I just
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Can I just throw in? I don't think anybody who really understands what was going on thinks Google was avoiding tax, was paying tax in accordance with the law in this country, just as it should have done. And let me say that the amount of tax on which they paid, the amount of profit on which they paid tax was commercially the right amount. What is going on at the moment is a pretense that companies are earning more within the jurisdiction that is seeking to tax than they actually are. It's deception on the public. The idea that Google was avoiding tax is fantasy land.
Can I just come back on Douglas's point about trading with the parts of the world that are growing most rapidly? The reality is that Europe has grown more slowly because Europe is very high income. It's a well-known phenomenon. Same with the US in terms of GDP per head. The higher your income, the slower your growth becomes. Chinese growth has slowed down as it has become much, much richer. So the countries which are doing the right thing and are catching up will be growing very, very rapidly. But actually, in order to trade, you've got to trade mainly. Trade is basically a function of income and proximity. And if you're going to trade a lot, we are going to trade a lot with Europe because we're close to them. We're going to trade a lot with Europe because they are high income.
Okay.
With respect, it's simply not the case that there's something automatic about eurosclerosis and stagnation. Since 1992, the year that the single market was created, any comparison of the key indices between the European Union and NAFTA will quite clearly show you that far more wealth was created in the United States, where they have a much higher per capita GDP than we have. They've been much more innovative. In fact, they've been at the leading edge of this new next stage industrial revolution, the digital economy. Many of the digital giants are notably American, not European. The idea that somehow there's something inevitable and we can be complacent about Europe's slow growth and stagnation, I find really quite extraordinary. Europe is falling behind, not only in relative terms, but in absolute terms, as a consequence of public policy, not because of something organic and natural. The idea that we have to trade with Europe because we're neighbours. Yes, of course, proximity is important, but proximity to markets has never been less important than it is at the moment. Like me, perhaps you have an iPhone. It was designed in California using chips from Japan, assembled in China with software from India. Where's the proximity between those different markets? We don't need to think of ourselves purely as a European player in economic terms when we can trade with the world. That's where the growth is.
Well,
Okay.
quick
Very
rebuttal,
quickly,
quick rebuttal on that. Over the next 3 years, OECD and IMF both have us growing more slowly than the rest of the European Union, and we are already growing substantially more slowly than the better performers within the European Union, including Ireland, including Germany. So it's nonsense.
Their predictions might be as good as the predictions of the economists for Brexit.
They might be, but actually they have a rather better track record.
We're not going to get into this discussion,
Okay.
but I agree with Chris, actually. But
I'd like,
go
to
ahead.
I'd like to bring this back onto the topic of tax havens.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
And the first point I'd like to make is that tax haven is a very emotive term to begin with. And personally, I would prefer the term international financial centre to tax haven. And I guess I just wanted to pose a question to David initially, and happy to take responses from the rest of the panel. Is it not the case that the fallacy that so-called tax havens are in somehow against regulation or international cooperation is exactly that, a complete fallacy.
Yeah. Of course, there can be a jurisdiction which doesn't regulate properly, but that's not an essential feature of something that you can call a tax haven. Anyway, the debate doesn't ask us to say we should become a tax haven. It says we should have tax haven status. I have defined tax haven status as a clear and concise code. And I'm afraid they all spoke about something different, but...
Well, it's a good question, actually. Is having tax haven status, are we then not a tax haven? Is that the point you're making?
You don't have to be a tax haven to have tax haven status if you define tax haven status, as I do, to mean having a tax code which you can understand.
What about banking secrecy, David?
Yeah.
I haven't come here to talk about banking secrecy.
But would this sort of
Got nothing
mythical
to do-
strategy of yours actually involve banking secrecy or not?
It's not a mythical strategy. This is an intelligible tax code.
But it doesn't have either banking strategy or super low.
Excuse me, neither does the 6 volumes of the direct tax code in this country. The question is, why do we have to have 6 volumes when an economy bigger than ours can cope with this tax
Well, I think
code?
we should have another debate about tax simplification, in which case I will be on your side.
Yeah,
But actually,
well,
for the
it's-
moment, we're having a debate about tax havens. I'm not on your side.
And we're talking about tax haven status.
All right, Joanna, go.
So that is how the Tax Justice Network defines tax havens, by those 3 criteria that I mentioned: low taxes, minimal regulation, and banking secrecy. Now, one can quibble about the definition, but the truth is that when one's trying to attract an influx of foreign capital, a lot of governments see it as contradictory to then raise regulation, raise regulatory standards, because that's not attractive to those capital providers. Sometimes it is, but it's not always. So generally the two go hand in hand. But there's certainly a more direct correlation, I think, between banking secrecy and low taxes. And we can see that in Taiwan, which has now been declared the new Asian tax haven because it's established OBUs, offshore banking units, which have 0 tax and high banking secrecy in order to attract renminbi trading, offshore renminbi trading, which was in fact an ambition of George Osborne's. So I guess one might say, not is the UK aiming to be the new Singapore, which of course has a 17% tax rate, which is far from, it's quite close to our own tax rate.
It'll be ours in 2020, by all accounts, right?
Apparently after the spring budget.
Yeah. Lowest in the G20.
2016 spring budget, yeah.
You're talking about corporation tax.
Corporation tax,
Yeah.
I am, and I'm sorry, when I talk about foreign capital, I am talking about corporation tax. But if you want to talk about Singapore, that's a slightly different case.
By the way, I'm not in favour necessarily of inflows of cash. What I'm trying to do is make life bearable for people here.
Just to reinforce the point on banking secrecy, if we were to have Singaporean-style banking secrecy, we would be not just attempting to trash our neighbours on their tax take, we would also be out of all civilized norms on anti-terrorist financing and on anti-money laundering financing, because banking secrecy protects terrorists and it protects money launderers as well, not just tax evaders. So we would be making an unbelievable choice, which frankly most of our international partners would think we were mad to do.
I know that in a debate you try to mischaracterize what your opponents are saying, but I find it extraordinary that those of us who want us to have a less arbitrary, fairer, simpler tax regime are being typecast as somehow wanting money laundering, terror finance, and arms dealing. I think you're overstating your case, Chris. We would like to see lower taxes, simpler taxes, and I don't think that really necessarily means that we're beyond the realms of civilized behavior.
So you do not want banking secrecy? You will be participating in the Financial Action Task Force of the OECD. You'll be participating in all of the current arrangements.
It's perfectly possible to
Would you-
have a low tax haven status and have international cooperation with other jurisdictions. It does your argument disservice to sort of suggest that we're all in favour of secrecy in arms deals.
Okay. I'm going to leave it. Yeah, let's have a question there and then we'll come to you. Go ahead.
Hello. I don't have a question, but I have a brief observation. In terms of innovation, it's telling that the UK took a lead on the patent box regime, if you remember. And it was, in fact, the EU, led by Germany, that really resulted in an alteration of the UK's very attractive low-tax patent box regime. So I'm wondering that whatever the debate is, whichever is stronger, that long-term, for innovation to work, some of the clever ideas do come out of the so-called tax havens. Case in point, Singapore. If you look at the attractive tax regime for robotics, the internet and so forth, it's 10, 20 years ahead of the UK. So there are some complexities there. I can see the UK has tried to take the lead, and interesting the EU has sort of snuffed that out, but that there is something to learn from low tax havens as well.
Can I just make one point about the EU and tax? The pile of proposals for tax harmonisation from the EU Commission is about that high off the table, because tax has never been subject to majority voting. It is always subject to unanimity, and the member states never agree. So the reason why, for example, there's been such tax competition is precisely because the EU member states won't even agree on a corporation tax base, for example. So you actually get competition between the member states, the Dutch writing specific code for specific companies, for example, which is outrageous. So don't say that the EU has been a major force in taxation harmonisation, because it simply hasn't.
Okay, go ahead.
Chris seems to say that Brexit's going to make us poorer and worse off. So what does he think the tax system should do in response to that? Surely if we're going to be poorer as a result, we need to become more competitive and have the system reformed in the way that David delineated.
Well, I think, two things. First of all, I think David's absolutely right about tax simplification, but there has been nothing to stop us doing that until now. Nothing at all. We could have adopted a similar style code to the German one. The German one has not been blocked by any EU action. So look to the motes in our own eye for that. It's our problem, and we should have sorted that out beforehand. So don't get involved in displacement activity, trying to blame foreigners for things which we should sort out at home. And the same thing goes for the housing crisis, for infrastructure investment, for productivity, for the standards of education, you name it. These are homegrown issues, and no EU matter has ever stopped us from dealing with them. So if we want to stop getting poorer, what we do is start doing things that businesses actually like, and the international community is going to start buying sterling again, so that we haven't got a 14% fall in sterling, which we've had since the referendum. That means a soft Brexit, it means a long transition period, and such a long transition period that I suspect it'll go over the next election, and we may find that we end up reversing the decision further down the track.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. Yeah, we've got a question here. I'm going to take this one, and if there's one more, I'll take that one, and then I want to hear the closing arguments. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Tony Kutzenboss from the Greg Bates Club. Thank you to the panel, first of all, for the debate. I want to try and bring it back to this thorny issue of the definition. I'm neither a legal expert nor an economics expert, so I don't mind being the person who asked the stupid question here, which is that I won't be able to vote for either side until you can both agree on a definition, otherwise I won't know what I'm voting on. So I really want to get a firm answer, and bear in mind the definition was set by this proposition, but I want to try and get a firm answer on whether your definition of tax haven status does actually include banking secrecy, as has been alluded to by the other side. And I want to try and get an idea of, you're differentiating, it seems, between tax haven and tax haven status. I want to understand what the difference is between those two things and why you've chosen one, not the other.
Right, how long have you got? Go ahead, yeah.
I don't know what is meant by tax haven or tax haven status. When I came to prepare for this debate, how can I define a tax haven? So I looked around at the I looked around at the tax features, only the tax features, that usually make a jurisdiction regarded as a tax haven, and I identified the two features which I mentioned. Essentially, only taxing income within its own border and simplicity. By the way, in 1955, when there was a Royal Commission reporting on the taxation of income and profits, they asked the revenue, there was a lot of suggestion that Britain should only tax domestic profits and not foreign profits. And they asked the revenue to tell them how many countries in the world taxed foreign profits in the same way as they taxed domestic profits. And the answer was one, this country. Nobody else in the world did it. The United States did tax foreign profits, but on a different basis and more favorable. The Commission rejected the proposal because they said it was too complicated. That was a bit wet. But this idea that you have to tax beyond your borders is not an essential idea to taxation. I didn't touch on it. The feature of simplicity. Now, most tax havens are former imperial possessions. They are using the tax code which they were given by the empire. It is broadly similar to our Finance Act 1918 tax code. It's very simple and it does the job. What we have here today, we were debating, those of us who live with it, we don't even know how many pages there are in the legislation. You can't work it out. Somebody said 50,000 pages. It's certainly more than 20,000 pages. And most of it is unintelligible. You can't live in a country that does that. It's suffocating.
All right, David, I'm gonna stop you now. I know you didn't get an answer to that question.
I'm not including banking secrecy.
Can I ask David one point? Because I mean, it comes back to this issue of what tax havens are. If you don't tax foreign profits at all, so that you tax only profits which are arising within your own jurisdiction, i.e. in the UK, then a UK company would have an enormous economic incentive to invest in other jurisdictions and not in the UK. And as an economist, if that proposal was introduced, I would be fairly confident that you would see a decline in UK investment and a rise in investment in other jurisdictions by UK entities. I'm not sure that's entirely what David was proposing.
It would surprise you to know then that when we stopped outward investment by introducing a controlled foreign companies regime, it stultified British business and had to be changed. So for British companies, it is now relatively easy to invest overseas without paying tax, and it doesn't seem to have stultified the economy.
Okay.
But we have double taxation arrangements.
Let me
We don't.
make it a really quick one, if you can, please. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Really interesting debate. I think I agree with this young man here that I'm still a bit confused about tax haven, status tax haven. But okay, we've discussed on the one hand of encouraging investment or making better British business. But will a tax haven status of Britain increase the tax take in Britain? I mean, a lot of what's been happening, particularly with the recent election, is that we've had austerity politics for 7 years, and there's a backlash. We're not investing in public services, in infrastructure, in public pay. If we now become a low tax status country, or we change our tax status, are we actually going to have more money for the infrastructure that makes our country great? Because I do appreciate Douglas's point. We are, it's not one of the best times to be in the UK, and I think we're losing.
When a couple of years ago there was a great row that took place over George Osborne's decision to lower income tax on the very wealthy, and I think I'm right in saying it went down from 45p to 40p or something like that. No, and 50p to 45. There was a great hoo-ha about making life easier for the very wealthy, but extraordinary things happened since then. Since then, those rich people have actually started to pay significantly more tax than they were paying under the old higher tax regime. So I think if you look at jurisdictions around the world, you quite often find that there's, over a period of several decades, a correlation between low taxation and simple taxation and an increase in trade and growth in that jurisdiction. When, for example, a British civil servant in the 1950s and 60s decided that Hong Kong should have a very open system, no one, and I'm sure had there been economists at the time, they would have come along with their PowerPoint presentations and explained to the nearest decimal point why that wouldn't work. But actually not taking people's wealth off them encourages them to create more wealth. And we've seen that again and again. I think if we lowered tax rates in this country, we would have a bigger amount of revenue. Laugher curve.
Okay.
Well,
Right.
I voted for the reduction to 45p for precisely the reason that Douglas has given. But there's actually quite a lot of economic research on this, and the Laffer point at which you begin to lose revenue is at about 40p. So if you got down to 40p, in terms of income tax, then actually you would begin to lose more revenue than you gained in the way that Douglas has suggested. The second point, you're absolutely right, is that the tax haven strategy has only ever worked for micro-states. If you look at the average the population of the UK is 65 million. We have to find jobs, not just for London, not just for half a borough in London, but for Sunderland, Hartlepool, Edinburgh, Glasgow. Jersey has a population of 100,000, Guernsey 63,000, Isle of Man 85,000, Cayman Islands 57,000, Bermuda 64,000, British Virgin Islands 28,000. These are micro-states. You can't have a strategy for a micro-state if you want a big economy.
Okay, Q&A ends now. What I want to do is we can get the original back up. Okay, we're going to hear a minute to a minute and a half closing statements from each from each speaker, same order as before. That's where we were at the start, by the way. 46% of you were for the motion, 38 against, 15 were undecided. So let's face it, quite a lot to play for with those undecideds. We'll see how you go after these closing statements. David, from your seat, give us a minute, minute and a half, no more.
Yeah, I've had a bit of trouble deciding whether to say anything about how much I earn. I think it's probably better if I don't. Anyway, I enjoyed it. Let me pick up on 4 points. First of all, I didn't say anything about rates. My definition of a tax haven involved the quality of its tax code. I'm really concerned with simplicity. And actually, a simple tax code can put up the tax take quite easily because it collects from a broader base than ours does presently. The complication in our tax code is caused by reliefs, which are only necessary because we have rates which are too high. Widen the base, lower the rates. That would reduce evasion, by the way, said to be one of the problems of tax haven status. Chris said what people want is quality. We don't have a quality tax system. We need a quality tax system. This is quite independent of Brexit, but Brexit provides the opportunity. Let us seize the day. It was said it would be politically impossible to make the change. Most people wouldn't know the change was being made. They wouldn't recognize it because I'm just tearing out pages that nobody's ever looked at. What we've had to suffer from is the invention of a bogeyman, a place which permits crime, encourages crime, doesn't allow people to look into the banks. It does everything wrong, but it has low taxes. That is not the tax haven status that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the tax haven status which comes from having a quality, simple tax code.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, David. Joan.
Oh, yes, thank you. My essential point is that whether you think that Brexit means whether you want a hard Brexit that involves free trade deals, or whether you're hoping for a soft Brexit that involves a continuing relationship with the EU and provision into EU markets. There needs to be a continuation of something other than minimal regulation in our strategy. And that includes banking secrecy too, because transparency is now an essential part of our regulation in many fields, but particularly in financial services. So whether we want trade deals or whether we want the provision of services into the EU, either way, it's absolutely essential that we maintain those regulatory standards. When it comes to taxation, I don't believe there's an appetite for a 0% corporate tax rate. That's the tax rate in places like Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, and Jersey. We've seen with Google and Starbucks and the scandals, really, and political attention that their non-payment of tax or their payment of very low taxes has invited that there simply isn't the political appetite for the low taxes, and I've already explained that we don't need the light touch regulation. So how is a tax haven strategy going to work for us?
Okay, thank you. Douglas.
Unless one really just wants to refight the referendum like Chris, I do think we need to ask how it is that we're going to pay our way in the world in the future. And in a sense, this doesn't really, it's not an argument contingent upon Brexit. We've had a huge and growing trade deficit. We're borrowing far more, and we're simply not paying our way in the world. I don't believe that the answer is this sort of caricature of a money laundering, terror financing, arms dealing offshore island. I think it's perfectly possible to be what I would regard as a tax haven, which is to say that you have a simple tax code. Simplicity is actually more important than the rate of taxation. You have a tax code and a rate that allows you to attract capital. That's not to say that you have no cooperation and secrecy, but that you remove the arbitrary, complex system that has grown up over the past 30 years, which criminalizes rational behavior and forces sensible people to behave irrationally. I think that's a perfectly reasonable ask. Chris said that only small states have tried low tax. Well, that's not really true. The United States has a simpler tax code than us and has grown better and faster and been far more innovative than we have. Australia, I note, has a simpler tax code too, and I think they're in their 25th year of consecutive growth. So it can be done, and it doesn't mean you become a money laundering, drugs dealing centre of the universe for doing so.
Okay, thank you, Douglas. Chris.
Let me make absolutely clear that I'm entirely in favour of tax simplification, but that is not what this debate is about. This debate asks us to vote for tax haven status for the UK. And there is an entirely accepted international definition of tax haven status, which the OECD task force has signed up to, G20 has signed up to. It involves banking secrecy, low tax rates, and low regulation. There is no economic strategy that will make this economy work as big as it is on the basis of those three things. If we go for banking secrecy, we would be trashing our neighbours, not just on tax, but also on terror financing, also on money laundering. If we go for low tax, we will be trashing our own public services because we are too big an economy to do that. And if we go for low regulation, we're opening the doors to more Grenfell Towers and not fewer. So if we want to be a good, successful economy, whether we're Brexiting or not Brexiting, soft Brexiting or hard Brexiting, you can only do that in an economy the size of ours by being a good neighbour and not a bad one. So we have to adopt a strategy for a big country, which is what we are, and not for a micro-state. Apart from anything else, we don't have the weather for being a tax haven.
All right, Chris, Joanna, Douglas, and David, thank you very much indeed. Get voting. This is working now, I'm told. I'm going to remind you of where we were before in just a moment. So do vote based on what you've heard. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. As I said, I think it was a tough one to stick to, it seemed. Yeah, I think we did deviate somewhat, but that was to be expected given given the subject here tonight. Beforehand, we had 46% of you for the motion. We had 38% against the motion, and we had 16%, I think that I'm right in saying if my maths is correct, undecided. Let's put up, if you voted now, where you stand, and we'll see where we go. If for some reason this doesn't work, I'm going to ask you to show your hands. If that doesn't work, we're going to go grab a drink. Look at that. There you go. We've had a complete turnaround. 28% we're down to from 46. The disagrees, i.e. the againsts, are now 67%. The undecideds, 3%. You guys picked up a lot of the undecideds. This motion is defeated. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.
Thanks, Dad. I think we lost that one.